Welcome to Kitchen Sink University, all you loyal deep sink divers. I am Casey Rochfort, and I'm bringing you another installment of the how-to series. I'd just like to go over the basics of how to conduct good web research. So, I guess where I'd like to begin is with Google, or your preferred search engine. But there's one particular aspect of Google that is actually really helpful. Oh, here's the mascot, and that I will get to in a moment for looking at data. If you're just doing like a general informational search, let's say. You don't necessarily need to come up with statistics or anything for your particular argument. You just, you want to say, oh, so-and-so was born on whatever date. Wikipedia is not a bad place to start for that. There's a caveat to this in that Wikipedia is generated by the collective mind. So anybody can go in and change something. A professor of mine once changed it so that the sky was orange and it stayed that way for several days. Things like that are quite telling in that you may come across some data on Wikipedia that isn't necessarily backed up by evidence. And so it's very important then when you start on Wikipedia to go down the rabbit holes. There's lots of links and citations and such. And if they don't have a citation, they tell you so you can take it with a grain of salt, or do a little digging of your own to see if you can corroborate what's being said. Many times there's a spin on these because, they are written by laypersons, and not everybody knows how to apply objectivity to information. And so, you have to keep all that in mind when you're reading things on Wikipedia. It could be slanted in a certain way. It could be wrong altogether. But oftentimes, it's pretty well handled. There's moderators. There's well-intentioned people who go and fix the mistakes. And all in all, it's a pretty well-running machine. So that said, when you follow the sources, it's always good to vet the sources. And there's a few techniques about this that some of this is a bit of interpretation that I think most people are probably capable of doing. You have to ask yourself, is this objectivity or is this more of an editorial, subjectivity? If there's a deal of subjectivity to it and it doesn't really matter one way or the other for the information you're looking at, it's probably fine. It's probably nothing necessarily wrong in that. If you get into some deeper philosophical discussions, you're going to see basically all editorializing, and that's fine. But when you do come across that, you should try to look at both sides, and not necessarily to try and convince yourself of the other side, but rather also to kind of understand where that side's coming from. It's really important to, even if you're pretty dang sure that your way of thinking is right, it's still good to look at and listen to the other side, process it, think about it, and try to apply it with an open mind. But that said, while changing your mind is good, you don't always have to. It's not, you can be right and people will still tell you that you're not. And that's why research is so important. You have to reaffirm that every now and then because new data comes out all the time. Now I'm kind of leaning into data a little bit, and I should hold that off because I'm going to get to that in the latter part of this class, which will come up shortly. But really quick, I just wanted to mention a few other things when you're vetting the sources that you're following down the rabbit hole from Wikipedia. So I've mentioned editorializing versus objectivity. There's also conflicts of interest. You don't see this a whole lot, but sometimes it's good to look at the author. Maybe they'll mention their credentials. Maybe they'll mention where they work. Maybe they'll say something in the article, if it's editorialization, that suggests that they may have a slant one way or the other. And then all you have to do is just keep that in mind when you're reading the information. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're saying anything wrong if they have a conflict of interest. It's absolutely possible for a person to remain very objective. You know, even like, let's say somebody works for Monsanto and they want to talk about the safety of GMOs. Well, you know, the skeptic in you is probably going to think, well, of course they're going to say they're safe because they work for Monsanto. And that's a logical fallacy. We'll get into that in another series. So anyway, moving on from that to the third and final point I want to make about vetting sources for information is a lot of the times you'll come across news sites for information. Now, not all news sites are created the same. There's some charts out there, and you know, some of these charts are made with a slight slant to them, of course, but by and far, mostly it's pretty accurate. You know, you've got kind of a spectrum. There's good stuff, there's bad stuff, and then in the middle, you've got your maybe take it with a grain of salt, maybe do a little research, maybe look at other news organizations, because they kind of fall in this spectrum of sometimes they report well, sometimes they don't. Some of those ones where you need to do extra research are things that people typically think are actually really laudable, like New York Times, CNN, NPR, and Fox News. You know, these are all pretty popular network or cable or newsprint kind of organizations that make a living off of reporting the news as objectively as possible. Well, sometimes that falls by the wayside, and there is editorialization that comes with reporting the news as well. So some of the good ones tend to be like the BBC, Science News, The Guardian, and then on the bad side, you got like Mother Jones and InfoWars and Huffington Post. It's mostly editorialization, and it's not always really well vetted. So those are things to keep in mind when you're looking at trying to research information. Now, to get to data, if you're looking for data, you know, you're trying to argue a point. You're trying to say, well, this law changed, and I think that X factor has increased or decreased. You know, let's say red light cameras go in. I think rear end accidents have increased. So you need to supply some data for that. May not exist, but you should do your due diligence in trying to find out whether or not that data is out there, and then try not to fall victim to making assumptions from the data that you do find to fill in the gaps. Don't want to do that. It's easy to fall prey to. So you can start from Wikipedia, but as I mentioned at the head of the class here, Google has a function called Google Scholar. And if you start there, you will use it as Google normally, but it returns journal articles. Now, journal articles are scientific articles that are peer-reviewed, and what that means is that they present data in a very objective way. It's very structured, and any experiments that they run are detailed in such a way that the experiments are repeatable, and thus the results they got and the conclusions that they make from those results should be pretty repeatable by their peers. And oftentimes people will repeat those experiments because they may be in line with the research that they're doing, and they want to see what the results are and if they're credible. And refutations are printed all the time. So it's not a bad thing to change your mind when you're presented with new data. And that brings me to another point. With Google Scholar, you can sort things by date. So you can say, I want to look at all the stuff from 2019 because a 1996 paper probably isn't going to help me when I'm looking for red light cameras because they basically didn't exist back then. So you can go to the left side of the screen and sort by date. And you can also, if you're looking for a particular keyword within that search, you can hit Control F. That brings up the find function, and you can put in a particular keyword that you want to scan through real quick and find. And you're probably asking yourself, well, why don't I just put that in the search bar? I mean, you can do that, but it's a little more generalized of a search that way. This is quick. Your eyeball will just pick something up, quickly scan a sentence, see whether or not it makes sense for what you're really looking for. Because the algorithms, they look for just the word. There's no real context to it. So what you have to do there is, try the Control F. That will help you find things. And how to read a journal article is a little touchy. It takes a little practice. There's some different techniques to it. You don't necessarily have to read it start to finish or in order. And I'm going to get into that in another class. So watch out for that one, how to read a journal article. But when you do find a particular keyword that you're looking for, or if you're having trouble actually finding that particular keyword or phrase, I should say, there's a way to narrow things down. Say you want to remove certain words from your search. Like, I'm tired of seeing these come up because they're not relevant. Hit that little minus, write the word you don't want to see in your search bar, and then put quotations around a phrase that you want to see. Like, well, I don't just want to see articles that talk about red. I want to see red light camera. So you put quote, red light camera, unquote, and it will find red light camera and leave out red or camera or light. Because if you have light in there, you're probably going to get a lot of like optics papers and things like that. That will have nothing to do with what you're looking for. So it's basically ways of reducing the amount of time it takes you to research, because research does take a long time. And if you can find ways to speed it up, that really helps, believe me. So, I've talked about how to refine your research, how to vet your research. And I think I've tried to instill this idea that you should take it with a grain of salt if there's an obvious amount of subjectivity to it. And I really just want to stress that doesn't mean you have to discount it. Everybody has opinions, and it's impossible to write without bias. You can reduce it as much as possible. There is always bias. History is written by the winners is a popular saying, I think. And it really goes to show that the way a story is told will always have a slant. So I think that's a pretty good start to web research. If you have any questions or anything you want me to elaborate on, go ahead and leave a comment, and I would be happy to go into further detail on a particular portion of what I've covered here. And, I plan to expand on stuff in coming classes. So thank you for deep sink diving into the how-to series, and we'll see you next class.